Thank you for joining today's webcast on federal and state legislation impacting public sector pensions. My name is Hank Kim, and I'm the Executive Director and Counsel for the National Conference on Public Employee Retirement Systems. Today's program is part of our Center for Online Learning, which provides remote continuing education to public pension trustees, staff, and other fiduciaries and stakeholders. Today, we will start by reviewing state and federal legislation from the first half of this year. Then we will shift our focus to legislation and policy that we're keeping an eye on for the balance of 2019. Joining me today are our contributors Bridget Early, Executive Director of the National Public Pension Coalition, and Tony Roda, partner at the law and lobbying firm of Williams Jensen. Today's format will begin with a moderated conversation with our two panelists, but we will reserve the last part of the program for your questions. We have a lot to cover, so we're going to get started immediately. But before we do, I do want to say, please submit your questions by using the GoToMeetings portal. So Tony, welcome again. Thank you for being here. Bridget, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
And Tony, let me start with you. Give us a quick summary of all the things that have gone on here in Washington, D.C. since we last did our webcast in January.
It's a tall order. But what I thought I'd do initially is to kind of approach it thematically.
Sure.
Congress seems to be quite interested in three basic areas. The first is to, and there are multiple provisions in various bills that we'll talk about, but the first is to enhance savings in defined contribution plans. And we'll see a lot of changes with IRAs, 401k rules, 457B plans. The second broad theme is they recognize now the longer life expectancy. And those first two themes, you're going to see provisions in the Secure Act, which has been passed by the House, H.R. 1994, and also the second generation of pension legislation called Portman-Cardin, after Senators Portman and Cardin, S. 1431. And the third broad theme is really regarding DB plans, and we've seen this in the multi-employer bill discussion, is this concern that members of Congress are raising over the levels of the assumed rates of investment returns. So with that as the backdrop, I'm going to cover tax-related issues, health care, and I'm going to touch on one regulatory issue. But let's talk about the Secure Act, because that's the principal retirement and pension bill that the Congress has been working on. And as I mentioned, it's already passed by the House. So just a couple provisions. One important provision is that it would move the age date, which triggers required minimum distributions for qualified plans, to 72 from 70 and 1/2. It would also remove the cap on IRA contributions, which are now also at 70 and 1/2. It would just take the cap completely away. Both provisions you see guided towards enhancing savings at that level. And then it would provide a requirement to disclose what your pool of assets are going to look like as an income stream in retirement. So very important provisions. Portman-Cardin, as I mentioned, the next generation, would take the required minimum distribution age all the way to 75. And they would do that beginning in year 2030. And also when you think about saving, the catch-up provision, what we're used to now, the over 50 catch-up provision, under the Portman-Cardin legislation would be moved for those who are age 60 and older to $10,000 a year. So enormous change for the ability to save. The second issue I'll talk about, which Congress has been working on, is the multi-employer bill.
So let me ask you to hold that thought for a minute, and let me turn over to Bridget. And Bridget, can you give us sort of a characterization of what's been happening at the state level since January?
Yep. So this past session, we saw the results of the 2018 election. A lot of state chambers changed compositions. In some states where term limits have been enacted, we've seen just the effects of that, of a new batch of legislators that have come in and don't have the same historical knowledge of the systems as maybe some more senior legislators would. So, you know, a lot of the focus has been for our coalitions is to educate broadly, not just about, I think, the problem that has been identified in the state, whether that was plan design funding or you know, some retiree relief in the form of COLAs. Really taking a step back and saying, overall, this is what you should know about the plans and the systems and why these benefits have been determined and what that historical context has been. So we really engaged in that space in several of our states, whether it was in Oklahoma or Arizona, creating space for legislators to come and learn more about the history, not just from the membership organization side, but also inviting systems to participate. Or in other states where we couldn't necessarily bring everyone together, create materials that would be distributed across the board for folks to have some sort of context.
Okay.
So education.
Yeah.
Education's been the big theme of the
So
session.
if we could borrow a little bit of Tony's thematic, cover that we could put on. One is certainly educating new and maybe even existing legislators at the state level. Would you say, are there any other thematic things that are going on at the state level?
Yeah, I think organizationally we have also really focused on broadening the conversation and the umbrella of who is impacted by pensions. A lot of coverage is around taxpayer burden when it comes to the unfunded liability that opponents like to drive. And we have really tried to take in-state stories of people impacted by pensions to lift up the impact that they can have, not just on a retiree who is, you know, dedicated their career to public service, but say a local business owner who is impacted by the spending of pension dollars as well, or, you know, making sure that state and local governments are aware of the work that you all did with the impact on tax revenue that is generated by systems. So we've created a space on our webpage called Pensions on Main Street that brings all of that information together.
Great. So we'll talk in detail about some of the state activities a little bit later, but going back to you, Tony, you were talking about multi-employer legislation. So give us the details on that, but maybe you should start by saying, why do we care as public sector pension community?
Exactly, because these are plans for private sector employees, and these are union negotiated, collectively bargained plans, different than ours. But we've always watched this multi-employer legislation closely for parallels and precedents for what Congress might do in a serious situation that state and local governmental plans could face in the future, although we don't see that. But we definitely watch it closely for parallels. And again, what we've seen in this context is that members of Congress will bring into the debate parallels. They'll make their own parallels, for instance, in the assumed rates of investment return. One criticism of the legislation that passed out of the House Ways and Means Committee a couple weeks ago, and that bill, as we were just discussing, passed by a pure partisan split. And the Republicans criticized it for not getting at the underlying problems. And one of the underlying problems they cited was the fact that these plans were allowed to use very high rates of investment return. But they didn't stop there. They also said, look, looming over here is the state and local governmental crisis with regard to their funding status. And a number of members on the Republican side brought that into the debate. And the concern we have had is we have seen legislation introduced targeted at state and local plans. The Public Employee Pension Transparency Act, which we call PEPTA, was just introduced in the previous Congress, H.R. 6290 by Congressman Nunes, who is the second most senior Republican on the Ways and Means Committee. That legislation would require each state and local plan to report their funded status based on their assumed rate of return, but also on a Treasury bond curve, which is going to show a dramatic change negatively for their funded status. So the more rhetorical attacks we have, and the more, especially for newer members who come to the committee and they hear this for the first time, this gets into their mind that, okay, yeah, there is a problem out there, and maybe PEPTA could provide us with some useful information. So that's kind of why we care. And in fact, not our fears, but our, I think, genuine concerns have kind of crept into the debate.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So bottom line, this bill to help the private sector union negotiated pension plans, largely they're okay, but there are significant plans that are in crisis mode. This bill would help them out. It was passed along party lines, and as part of the speeches during committee hearing, there was talk about not only is this just the beginning, but there are state and local plans.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Okay. Great. So, Bridget, let me go back to you. At the state and local level, what were the activities specifically that you've been keeping an eye on?
Yeah, so the three, again, themes that I mentioned earlier being plan design changes, funding, and COLAs. Starting with plan design, this is always something that I think you see at the beginning of a lot of sessions where there are a lot of placeholder bills that are introduced that talk about the potential for converting new employees to a DC system. And we saw similar bills in Arkansas, Louisiana, Missouri, certainly. And fortunately, nothing came of that. We knew that Arizona, we had some well-funded opponents there who have been looking to make similar changes, but their efforts weren't successful this year. But we are anticipating that this fall they will start, they'll renew their efforts to start having actual language that would change some of the defaults for maybe some of the state systems as well as, the state university systems, as well as what the overall state system would encounter. In New Jersey, there's been a lot of attention there because the Senate president has introduced a plan to make some plan design change, creating a hybrid system to address some of their liability. That is his solution to address the liability. And then Kentucky, to touch on it briefly, and I'll talk more about what's currently happening, but Kentucky, we've seen just that it's always there's always something happening in Kentucky. And after our last webinar, our folks won the lawsuit against the governor that threw out a bill which would have made drastic changes to the system. It triggered the governor called a special session that was not fruitful for him. And then over this legislative session, both chambers created a legislative working group. And so from that, there was no language, but just sort of an establishment of a process that they would talk about what reforms or proposals they were thinking of introducing. Mm-hmm. So plan design, that sort of sums up plan design for this year.
Okay. So Tony, going back to you, as I think most people know, Congress is divided. It's the majority in the House are Democrats, the majority in the Senate are Republicans. Has that dynamic provided any opportunities for public sector pensions?
It really has, certainly. And we have friends on both sides of the aisle. Certainly, we don't want to diminish that fact. But the House being controlled by the Democrats provides us with a little bit of a breather on having to play defense so aggressively. So we can look at the offensive agenda. For instance, this week, the House is going to vote on a repeal of the 40% excise tax that came into law through the ACA, and that public pension plans have been concerned about since it was enacted. And the date of enactment was pushed out and pushed out and pushed out. So the House will vote on repeal. I expect it to pass, and then I expect a lot of pressure to be put on the Senate to do something on that. It's been an issue that once enacted, I think both sides ran away from.
Yeah.
The second area I would mention is also healthcare related. And we've seen it play out throughout the country. We're going to hear a lot about it through the presidential debates, Medicare for All, or an early buy-in to Medicare for everyone who reaches a certain age. The primary bill is age 50, that it has been introduced in both the House and the Senate. So everyone age 50, if that legislation were enacted, could buy into Medicare. There's a proposal that is being developed by Senator Sherrod Brown of Ohio, and Congressman Tom Malinowski of New Jersey and Harley Ruda of California, which is a different part of the spectrum on that issue, which would recognize the fact that first responders retire early, well before the Medicare eligibility age of 65, and that their options in the healthcare marketplace are shrinking and becoming more expensive. So this legislation would, and I expect it to be introduced in September or October, would for the first time provide an early buy-in to Medicare for first responders. I think it's powerful politically. You know, as I started this part of the conversation, I mean, we have friends on both sides of the aisle in public safety. That's true in spades, that they have friends on both sides of the aisle. So this is going to be an interesting political discussion. And if the bill is introduced correctly with the right stakeholders, I think that proposal will also creep into the presidential debates. It'll be very interesting to see.
Okay.
The other thing on the offensive agenda that I'd mention is we all know about the current HELPS statute, which is a $3,000 income exclusion if a retired public safety officer uses the $3,000, up to $3,000 from a retirement distribution for a health care premium. There's an office from Illinois, a House office, that is looking at doubling the $3,000 to $6,000, which makes infinite sense. The $3,000 was set in law in 2006, never been changed, never been indexed, so it really is crying out for a change and an increase. And then there'll be another issue that we'll talk about on that when we meet with the congressman's staff, dealing with the direct payment requirement that exists where the public pension fund must actually be paying the insurance provider, which is fine if there's just one or two providers, but where there are many, it becomes an administrative burden. And we've heard that some plans just haven't been taking advantage of this tax exclusion because of the burden.
Yeah, we knew that since the enactment of the PPA, which the HELPS provision was part of, and that number of plans essentially said we have too many. We have too many providers. The process is too convoluted, and as a result, we're not going to expend plan resources on it. So
right.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So for folks who are tuning in, again, this is our mid-year webcast on federal and state legislation impacting public sector pensions. We encourage audience participation, so please submit your questions using the GoToMeetings portal. Bridget, what else is going on at the state level? Are there any offensive or positive news that you can report?
Yeah, so, and that's been a really exciting development this year, that some of the positive things that have come out, I feel, for quite some time. A lot of our organizations were built around defense, so it's been nice to have productive, positive conversations. So, you know, obviously one of the biggest things a state can do is fund their system.
Yeah.
We talk about it a lot. And again, I think just sometimes lawmakers may not understand that impact. But, you know, in Kansas, we saw the repayment of about over $100 million to KRS, which had been borrowed by the Brownback administration. And so here's a Republican legislature that made that payment and, you know, corrected prior wrongs. So that was really exciting. In Texas, we saw additional dollars go into TRS, which was very helpful. Louisiana ended its year with some budgetary surplus, that a portion of that money went into the systems to help pay down the unfunded liability. Illinois, which is historically had funding issues, ended up with some additional gross receipts that instead of putting it elsewhere, put it towards the pension system. So it was really exciting to see those efforts being made. And then another positive thing that I think we don't talk about as much, and that organizationally we've been trying to lift up, especially through Pensions on Main Street, is the reality of living on a fixed income, and that while pensions provide the most secure benefit, it's not, they still need a little bit of help making sure that people are still able to live with dignity and security in their retirement. And since a lot of systems, COLAs are based on funding triggers, a lot of seniors have been left behind with the rising cost of inflation on just your normal goods, as well as the rising cost of health care, have not seen COLAs. We know in Oklahoma, it's been 12 years. In Wyoming, I believe it's been at least 11. In Kansas, it's been 21 years that seniors have had to make do with what has been fixed for them, nearly 2 decades ago. Yeah. And so we've made an effort in several of these states to have the conversations of why this is necessary, and have been able to actually have some success. Last year, I know we talked about some of the 13th checks that were issued in Oklahoma and New Hampshire. New Hampshire actually did pass a true COLA, so if you have been retired for over 5 years, the governor still needs to sign into law, but the bill would provide a COLA for those retirees. Wyoming, we had a very fast-paced session this year because it was a shorter session, but the House actually took up a bill that didn't make it out of committee, but the conversation was there. Wyoming, surprisingly, has one of the highest rates of inflation in the country, so a lot of retirees are being left behind. And then Oklahoma, both chambers sent to analysis 2 different COLA percentages. So luckily, when they reconvene later this year, there will be data to have a robust conversation around what best serves retirees in Oklahoma.
Great. And Bridget, when we started, you mentioned a couple of legislative educational sessions. Do you plan on doing, let's talk a little bit more about that, and then do you plan on doing any more for the balance of the year? So
right now, with, I think, what we experience in DC, we experience in the States, is that it's summer and everybody's on vacation, or, just kind of wants to take a break from policy. Yeah. And then, of course, several states, if not in November, at the beginning of 2020, will have elections. So like Kentucky, Louisiana, those are 2 gubernatorial election states. And then in 2020, primaries, presidential, all that fun happens. So I think we will reevaluate in our fall planning with our coalition states, where are there opportunities to bring people together and have those. We just don't have anything certainly planned, but would love to. We know that there is certainly a value added when the plans are able to participate as well. Yeah. In Arkansas, it was helpful to have the plans in the room when we did our meeting there. In Arizona, it was really helpful because you're going directly to the source, and who else is going to be a better expert on the systems than the systems themselves? Right.
So I would say this is a call out to the folks who are watching that if you are, thinking that your state would benefit from this coordination and education that NPPC is providing, whether you are a plan member or a stakeholder or a union or a plan sponsor member, please let us know. And I think Bridget would be happy to think about coming out to your state.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So Tony, let me throw it back over to you. Anything else relative to what happened in the first half before we start looking forward to the second half of the year?
There's something that should have happened in the first half, but maybe will happen soon, and that is the reintroduction of legislation to reform WEP, the windfall elimination provision, which is a Social Security penalty that affects public sector workers who've also had a career in the private sector with FICA-covered employment. And the WEP has been a thorn in our side for decades, and we have hope that the new chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Richie Neal of Massachusetts, will be introducing soon a WEP partial reform, partial repeal bill. It'll look a lot like legislation that was introduced in the previous Congress by then Chairman Kevin Brady. And I'll give the audience that bill number so you could take a look at the basic design of it. It's H.R. 6933 from the previous Congress, 115th Congress. But what it does essentially is split the universe into two. And it says if you're being hit by WEP, or if you will be hit by WEP by a certain date, meaning you'll reach Social Security age, you will get a monthly rebate to offset the penalty. But you will still be hit with WEP forever. Everyone after that magic date, whatever date is selected, would be have their Social Security benefit calculated on a proportional formula. And a lot of folks have different views on the proportional formula, but it seems to many that this is a good starting point for a discussion as to how to fix WEP going forward. So we're hopeful that that will happen soon. The other, Bridget, did you want to? No.
No, sorry.
The other issue that was recently introduced is pickup legislation. Mm-hmm. So we've had this issue on Internal Revenue Code Section 414H2, which precludes, under the IRS interpretation, a plan from allowing existing employees to choose between either two pension plans or two tiers with different employee contribution rate. That has been in place since 2006 by revenue ruling, and there have been attempts to provide more flexibility to that. So new legislation has been introduced on the pickup, H.R. 3213 in this Congress. This is the fourth of the last 5 Congresses where there's been pickup legislation. There's been union opposition to changing it, and that has impeded any progress. The other issue that I'll mention, and Hank and I, we've done some meetings on this, is the financial transactions tax, which is not entirely new as an issue. But again, given the presidential debates and the discussion surrounding how do you fund really big things, like shoring up Social Security or shoring up Medicare or dealing with student debt, this financial transactions tax on financial transactions, equity transactions, bond transactions, derivatives, is coming, I think, more and more to the fore. Not that it's going to be enacted. I don't want to mislead folks, but as a discussion point, the two principal pieces of legislation in the Senate are one by Senator Schatz of Hawaii, S647, and then S1587 by Senator Sanders. And Hank and I have been in both of those offices recently, just trying to gather information and understand the real purpose and thrust of it.
Yeah. I will say that we've gotten some requests by our fund members as to whether NCPERS has a position on the financial transaction tax. Currently, we do not. So that's part of the reason why we went in to visit the sponsors' offices to gather more information. We would also say, to the extent that you believe the financial transaction tax will have an impact on your plans, please let us know. I think that will go a long way towards informing us as to how we may take a position on it. And also, the sponsors themselves are seeking feedback from the community. So please let us know if you've been inquiring about it or if you have some thoughts about it, because they are asking us to provide them with some feedback. So anything else in the first 6 months?
No, I don't believe so. We can look forward now. If you'd like.
Okay. Bridget, any last words relative to the rearview mirror?
Nope.
Okay, well, let's start out with you then. What about the beginning? So let's assume we're August, there's not going to be any activity. September through the end of the year? What are you anticipating? What are you keeping an eye out on?
Yeah, so we are obviously monitoring states such as Arizona, where we know opponents are going to start discussing some draft legislation for the winter or for the next session. So, Arizona being an example in which we know opponents are going to start drafting those proposals, but then, just broadly making sure that whatever conversations that tend to arise over the months that create space for especially our opponents to come in and jump on some of the fear mongering around unfunded liabilities. So we keep an eye on, when credit rating agencies start weighing in and blame pension unfunded liabilities on, or they utilize, those liabilities to downgrade credit ratings or threaten downgrades. So we will continue to monitor that. We will also continue our efforts in drawing the connections between how pensions create fiscal efficiencies within these state budgets, and they do so through two different ways. As I mentioned before, the spending of pension benefits, which your organization and other organizations have done a lot of research on, and the investment of assets creates tax revenue directly through investments or indirectly through pension spending. And how do we lift that up as a foil to what else gets spent? Pensions aren't their own they're not just like a separate budget from a state budget. The state budget covers all of these things, and so when we only focus on pensions and we just double down on the miseducation or misinformation around unfunded liabilities, we're missing the whole picture. And how are we holistically looking at a budget to make sure that wherever we're putting a dollar, that dollar is going to have a maximum impact? And the other fiscal efficiency it creates that we've seen is the recruitment and retention of skilled public employees. We saw a city, Branford, Connecticut, in their contract negotiations with their police force, reopen their DB because the plan switch caused attrition in the workforce, and that spiked training costs. So how are we lifting those stories up? The other piece that we're monitoring that we will see is Kentucky. Kentucky, as usual, is its own fun little world. They're going to have a special session, the governor announced on Friday, and so we will be monitoring that while the state debates how to address their quasi-agencies and the spike in their contribution that they've seen and the different ways in which both sides are trying to address that. So.
Okay. And I guess this is a good time to just remind folks that NCPERS and NPPC, we jointly reissued the Public Pension Defense Toolkit earlier this year. Yes. I believe we released it back in April of this year. And we did a webcast on it as well. But as folks are preparing for upcoming legislative sessions, whether it's continuation this year or for 2020, it is a resource that I think you should all take a look at. Great. Tony, what about September through December here in DC?
So a couple of issues that I mentioned earlier, the Secure Act and the Multi-Employer Pension Bill, we hope that there is finality on both. I think there's a very good chance on the Secure Act, although there are some holds in the Senate, hold being a euphemism for a senator basically saying, no, not until my issue is dealt with. So there are 3 or 4 of those that have to be cleared for the Secure Act to move. But we're hopeful. The multi-employer, it is a serious issue with 1.3 million workers and retirees having their pensions kind of in the crosshairs here. So politically, it should be something that Congress can address. I would look for action on those 2 items in the fall. We'll see. I mentioned the high premium excise tax, the 40% tax. The House does pass with a strong showing this week a repeal of that. Put a lot of pressure on the Senate. We should have introduction of the WEP bill and the Medicare buy-in for first responders. So I see those being the primary legislative issues. There could be a major regulatory change or proposed change. The Office of Management and Budget is supposed to, by statute, put out every 5 years a super circular, which is a wonderful word for pulling together a lot of guidance on how states and the federal government cost account. And one of those areas where there's guidance is for pension costs related to federally salaried or partially salaried state employees, and how the pension costs are allocated between the federal government and the state. So we'll be watching that very closely. These regulatory issues are very hard to predict, and the timing of which is anybody's guess. But they have been saying with a little more certainty that the fall looks like the time when they'll have a new proposal. The only other thing I'd mention is, and we've seen it rise up and then fall back in the political scrap heap, is infrastructure. And infrastructure is, of course, needed without question. As you just drive around and use our highways and airports, you see the need for it. And it's easily recognizable but hard to fund. And so this is going to be an area that has to be addressed. Can it be addressed this year or even next year? I don't know. But there will be some issues if infrastructure is really closely examined that'll be of interest to public pension plans.
Okay. So I think we've covered both looking back and looking forward. So we're at the point where we should answer some of the questions that have been asked. So Tony, I think this is for you. Regarding the HELPS provision, is it absolutely certain that the payment has to come from the retirement systems? There have been some ambiguity as to whether it's self-reporting or whether it has to go to a plan.
It is my understanding that it must. That it must go from the plan there must be a chain of record from the plan to the insurance provider. And if anyone out there has information that we should look at to know that there's a nuance, please let us know.
Okay. And Bridget, tell us a little bit about NPPC. Obviously, you serve a function in terms of overviewing all the various activities at the state, legislative activities. But there's another component to NPPC, right? There's a grant-making function. So tell us a little bit about that.
So annually, we organizationally put out a grant in the late summer, early fall, asking for proposals from from any state, in which we're convening stakeholders that not on the policymaker side, but rather membership organizations and the systems themselves and any of our other allies coming together in anticipation for pension legislation coming up in your state in the upcoming session. And through that, we take our knowledge and our resources nationally and really help try to build those coalitions that can create a game plan to addressing and educating policymakers on the issue, as well as the history of why this is becoming an issue. Because again, as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, lawmakers don't stay there are some that stay forever, but there is a transition that happens, and through that turnover, history can be lost, and so we really have to be good stewards of the narrative of how we have gotten to where we are. And it's helpful that the systems can provide an insight on, what they have done investment-wise or any other innovations that they have taken, and membership organizations can come to the table and talk about, historically we have, we renegotiated contracts or we gave back, what have you. This is what we gave to make sure that at the end of the day, as many employees can have a sound retirement. So, each state is its own puzzle that we pull together. And then if you're not in a state that has a grant, we take all of NPPC sort of historical knowledge and experience in the states and are able to offer assistance. So Arkansas was not a state in which we had a grant, but we were able to go in and help them develop a legislator education program. In a couple other states, creating just sort of social media graphics or fact sheets that they can use to educate lawmakers on some of the key talking points that we know are effective in other states that we've had to go and talk to lawmakers in. So we have those resources. We also have the resources around external communication. Engaging press is very important because that is a lot of times how the general public will get information about systems, or about pensions in general. And so we make sure that we are countering any narrative that detracts from the issue. So, so when Josh McGee puts a op-ed out that says there's not a retirement crisis, how do you respond to that? Yeah. Things like that. Luckily, we didn't necessarily take the time to respond because it didn't seem to gain a lot of traction. Right. But just examples like that we at least monitor and know that information exists out there. So.
Right. Tony, so one thing you did not mention is a major issue that happened in late 2017, I believe, when the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was going through, which is the unrelated business income tax.
Right.
What do you think are the likelihood of that coming back later this year or sometime in 2020?
The proposal or the provision that was in the House-passed bill in 2017 would have subjected state and local governmental plans to the UBIT tax. And that would have had a chilling effect, and it would have rearranged the investment decisions that public plans have to make every day. We were pleased that it was not included in the Senate bill or in the conference report. It did have a revenue score in a positive way, $1.1 billion over 10 years. Now, in the scheme of a large tax bill, $1.1 billion over 10 years is not a huge amount of money. In a smaller bill, it could be. So I think once your language is drafted, once the arguments have been reduced to black and white, there's always the possibility that Congress can take it off the shelf and try to use it again. I don't see the Democratic majority in the House going down this path, but I think in the future we definitely have to watch it closely. And if I might, yes. Going back to the previous question, I understand the self-reporting. If I could just... Yeah, so when you fill out your 1040, there's a pension distribution line. That pension distribution line, assume you were at 30,000 that year. Right next to that line is the taxable pension distribution line. And so what you would do if you had the 3,000 that did go from the fund to an insurance provider is you would put 30 here and 27 here. So there is that aspect of self-reporting that exists today.
Okay, thank you. And Bridget, finally, you've talked about our opponents. Who are they and what are you hearing from them?
Yeah, so we have seen, I think towards the end of last year, we did a video around how the Koch brothers have an influence in this space. And we see a lot of that through their state policy networks, so organizations that sound bipartisan or nonpartisan coming in and trying to, again, drive miseducation around unfunded liabilities. Because a lot of taxpayers who, aren't public employees, who aren't, monitoring the state budget or have a background in state finances, just a lot of times get the information that there's this unfunded liability and this misunderstanding that it needs to be due tomorrow, right? Like there's this bill and it's coming. And so sort of taking that misconception and being able to drive why all public employees should have defined contributions. You had some some research that came out of Bellwether that talked about how teachers are better off with the defined contribution plan because teachers don't stay in the system for longer than 5 years. And luckily, NCPERS put out counter research that actually showed educators do stay in the workforce, and that there's no defined contribution design right now out there that would ever equate to what a defined benefit would provide a teacher in retirement. Some of the language, though, that I think is concerning is when we hear our opponents talk about intergenerational inequality and having a hard schedule for the unfunded liability. And so I think we really just collaboratively need to do a better job of explaining how those terms are being misused to again drive poor decision making on policymakers' parts. Stripping away retirement security from a public employee, to me, will still put a drain on resources that would affect future generations. Having, a hard amortization schedule, I think can again create a crisis, an unnecessary crisis, where systems and policymakers aren't going to talk to each other, or policymakers may not talk to systems without fully understanding that, we need to meet this arbitrary deadline. Like, that's not, pension funds are like an accordion, right?
Yeah.
Like, you kind of got to move them in and out. And so we just have to really be careful when we start hearing that terminology being echoed not by our opponents, but by policymakers, to take the time to course correct.
Okay. Well, Bridget, Tony, thank you so much for joining me again. I look forward to hosting us in January when we get to look forward to 2020.
Yes.
And finally, I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. This will be our last webcast till September. So we'll take the month of August off. And so we look forward to hosting you again in September at our next webcast or webinar. Thank you so much.